society. So, welcome, Ruth. Thank you. Boy, there's friendly faces, new faces. This is wonderful. And more faces than last time, so I'm excited to be here. I'm RuthAnnKelley. I've lived in Oceana County 40 years plus. I have been researching Native American research for approximately 22 years. I got started on it because one of our members, Mr. Bill Field, if you've heard about the Montague Heart Bike Trail, that's Mr. Bill Field. He is part Native American. And he asked me to help him. I'm an avid genealogist to do his family history because he knew he had a Native American Indian great-grandmother that lived in Elbridge. And that's how I got started. And one thing led to another and my interest grew. And when I realized that there was no collected history of Oceana County's Native peoples, there was a need for it to start getting collected and gathered and put in one central location so that people who have an interest in that could find us and hopefully find about their families and the way of life of the people who came here. Tonight, we're talking about, I have heart disease, so if I have to stop every once in a while, bear with me, okay? I breathe, I forget to breathe. Rodney Negake. He was a grandson of a chief that we all know, and even still here up today, that came from the Lowell, Ionia area after the 1855 Treaty of Detroit to the Elbridge area. And Rodney is Chief Kabmusa's grandson by his daughter, Wasea Kabmusa, who married Jerome O. Negake. Rodney is their son. Rodney was born in 1847. He passed away in 1925 at Water. And he lived most of his life, adult life, here in the Oceana, Hesperia area. He sold a lot of Indian baskets. This happens to be one from the 1920s that was in my husband's family, one that was very similar to this. This one was owned by the editor of the Heart Journal, Al Chapman. He put it in one of our yard sales and I said, I want that basket. So I waited for the yard sale and got the basket. Little did I know that Rodney Negake was the basket maker until he told me all about it. And how he and his wife used this basket to put in their rumble seat to carry their picnic lunches when they would go on Sunday afternoons when you'd take a couple hours off. And they'd go for a ride around Oceana County. So when you look at this, you can see the craftsmanship of an Ottawa Indian basket from the 1920s, which is probably as close as you're going to get to what they may have made or similar to what they had made in the 1800s.
Long time.
Oh, okay. I have pictures that I brought with us from a file that we have. At our society, we have what we call a surname file. A surname file is like Smith, Jones, John, Negake, Kabmusa, whatever. And within that Kabmusa file, within the Jones file, you'll find whatever we've been able to collect from old newspapers, old school records, federal census of our county, register of deeds, and all kinds of things. A lot of times, families who are doing their genealogy will come along into the Historical Society and they'll bring their research. With that research, they may have photographs, they may have old documents. When they let us, we copy. When we let us, they may even leave it with us so that it will be there for years to come and for the next generations, because that's what we're doing this all for, is so that our great-grandchildren know our history. Oceana holds a very unique history in the fact that it had about 1,700 Native Americans moved from the Grand River Valley, which encompasses Grand Haven to Grand Rapids and Ionia and down toward Jackson. That's where the Grand River starts. And along there were 17 bands of Native Americans that were moved up north to Mason County and Oceana County. So if you came to my Indian research room, you're going to find a Negake file. Some of what I brought today is in that file. You can see it, and I see there's some Native American people here. If you want a photocopy, maybe the librarians will let you make photocopies afterwards. You're welcome to do that. You're welcome to come and read if you want. You can come to the Historical Society, and I can help you do your genealogy if you need that. If you need some historical information or research on a specific item, like maybe baskets, we will be glad to gather what we have and share with you. We're a great sharing group of people because we feel that everybody who comes here usually loves this county and the area where we live. And we want to teach you as older people. Go home and teach your grandchildren and great-grandchildren what a wonderful place this is for people to grow and mature. Have we had our problems? Why, of course we've had our problems. We're human beings. And we always have problems somewhere along the line. So, I'm going to start with just a few facts, if that's all right. But I got to put the glasses on. And I'm going to slow it down so I don't have such a hard time reading. Rodney Negake had a Native American name. His name was Seguns. This means small one, small person, small body. He was born the 25th of October, 1847. And by the way, that was 167 years ago, and we're still talking about Rodney, isn't that cool? In Lowell, Michigan. His occupations included trapper hunter, farmer, and basket maker. He was the son of Jerome Negake, or O Negake, and Elizabeth Kabmusa, whose Native American name was Wasea. Wasea was the youngest daughter of Chief Kabmusa of his third wife, Minise Nebikwe. Rodney had a brother John, born in February of 1850, and a sister Mary, to the woman that was his natural mother. But he had lots of stepbrothers and sisters. So when you think about this, this makes for a very large descendant family. I mean, there are lots of people who descend from Rodney and Wasea. Rodney married Margaret Pegamise. Now, Margaret wasn't a local Ottawa. Margaret was from up by Traverse Bay. She was born the 25th of December, 1855, so she was a bit younger. They had 9 children total. Between 1875 and 1898, 4 died young before adulthood, 5 lived to adulthood and left descendants. Rodney died the 31st of August, 1925, at Pentwater, Oceana County, Michigan. While there for the summer, he was 77 years old at this time. Now, you may find this nice newsletter. The writer of this newsletter is here this evening. And there's a picture of Rodney Negake's family camping at Nuego, here I am, at Pentwater. They would come in the summer when the resorters and traveling people would come because that's where they would go, was to Pentwater. They didn't come to Hart and Shelby. And they could sell baskets, pick berries. There was a fruit processing company in Pentwater. So there was lots of work to be done, and they enjoyed the summer along the lake. And if you know that when you come from inland Oceana, like Elbridge or Crystal, and you drop down and go into Pentwater in the summertime, it's a lot cooler over there. It's much more enjoyable to spend the summer there. And by this picture, you can see that they did. Look at their camping gear. They were comfortable, they were happy, and this was up there by the, what do they call, Joni, the old barn, Mears barn? Charles Mears barn, but it's the River House barn. when Charles Mears first came here, the Indians would come down the north branch of the Pentwater and the south branch, and they would be at Charles Mears's barn and trading post on that river, and they would trade goods with Charles Mears, the lumberman. So it has been a long history of the natives coming from inland to the shore to do things for the summer. This you might find interesting. Rodney had lived his early life in Elbridge Township. He was there on the federal census records, 1870, 1860, once with his father, once with his mother before he married. The mother had 3 husbands, Jerome Negake being just the first, but Rodney was with her until he married. And then he's on his own in Elbridge as the head of the house. His wife, Margaret, is there, and their children. You can follow them through the federal census. I also found that there is an 1880 special schedule, federal census, for agriculture, and Rodney Negake was on there with 40 acres. And it tells exactly how many acres were plowed, how many animals were there, what he was growing, and how many were in trees. How many acres might have been in trees, because by 1880, not everything up here had been cut for the lumbering unit. So he lived on the north end of Camusa Lake. Does any of you here know where Camusa Lake is? It's kind of set in the center of section 25 of Elbridge. And what I'm sure people called that area in the very old days is Camusaville. Because Camusa came, he brought his band, and most every one of the neighbors are either his sons or his daughters, sons-in-laws, 4 wives, and they made up this huge area into 3 sections of Elbridge. And Camusa Lake kind of sits in the center there. So Rodney lived up north of the lake. This is one section. Camusa had 80 here. He was a chief. Never any buildings there because he came here in 1860, died in 1863. And then Rodney, brother-in-laws and sister-in-laws and everybody else, took care of him until he died. So he was here approximately 3 years, and then the old chief passed away. He had sons that took over and were known as Chief Camusa also.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Where was Rodney? Do you know where he's buried at?
Yes, I'll get to that.
Oh, okay.
As a matter of fact, I'll do it right now so we get that answered for you. He's a Catholic family, which is one of the things I was going to talk to you next about, is that the Camusa family did not take to any specific religion until late 1800s. Jerome Negake and his wife Elizabeth Irwasea became Catholics, and they are buried in the St. Joseph Indian Catholic Cemetery in Elbridge Township. Answer that?
Yep, thank you.
There is some talk about Rodney being a Menominee Indian. There's absolutely no proof, but I have 3 pages that are copied from old Kent County history books, and they mention Mr. Negake or Negake. And some of it says he's a Menominee, one says he's a renegade from the Potawatomi, so I'm not real sure. None of them say he's an Ottawa. But of course he married in Ottawa, so then his children or descendants will be Ottawa. But you might find this interesting. This is what Kent County had to say while Rodney was still alive. These are written in the 1800s, so it's the closest written history to the time the man actually lived. Our county history books are written 100 years later, so this is the closest to it. And you can take a look at those too. Rodney and his family were very popular, not only in Oceana County, but in Newaygo County. Because when they first came, which would have landed them in what is called Fremont Center. Ring a bell with anybody? Fremont. There's a land deed to Negake in Nuevo County, and they lived right there when the first white people were coming into Fremont in about the 1860s. And you can go to the Register of Deeds office and find where they bought land. This wasn't granted land, this was an Indian treaty land, it's where they bought land. And what this does is it tells you a big hint that you should consider. And that is, this family being associated with the Kagmusa, see, Kagmusa bought land in Ionia too. They were some of the first Indians to actually put gold down and pay for land, so that they would wind up with the deed in their hand with their name on it. Now the first ones probably had the trader's name on it, like Rick Robinson down there, but this is an educated family. And why not? Chief Kagmusa was part French. He and his family had traded along the Great Lakes. His father was a trader, Antoine Campau. His mother was part of the Ottawa Indians along the Grand River. And they had been exposed to the French and the English even at Mackinac. So these were people who were educated and knew how to do things for themselves to better themselves. No white men were telling them that at the time. They were taking it upon themselves to progress along and so on. Of course, then the treaties came, then the treaties dictated, and we're not going to discuss that. That was a long time ago, and all I can say is I don't agree with everything that the federal government has always done. That should suffice. But this tells you that this is a special family, and that's why these people are still talked about today. I really feel that they left a big impression, and that they were progressive. They knew how to take care of themselves. They moved up from probably most of the bands that moved here. They were probably one of the more advanced group, along with the Baileys. Joseph Bailey, Francois Bailey, traders. They had been exposed to white men in the 1600s. So these were not primitive people. They were like our great-grandparents. They were living in the 1800s, and of course things back in that time are different than they are today. But this is a very special family. They kept together, they took care of each other. It's so apparent that they loved each other and they loved their way of life and their people. Just like I've done my genealogy and I love my people. It's just like, anybody else here a genealogist? Don't you love your people? Absolutely. Whether you know them or not, you love them.
I don't know any of them.
That's what a genealogist is. And does best, is love people. We have tried to collect things from the old newspapers. I don't know if you know it or not, but Patwater had a newspaper in 1864, I believe it started. One of the first newspapers in Oceana County. And there are little mentions of native life, little mentions of the people moving in, moving on, Charles Mears cutting trees, all kinds of things. So if you ever feel like you'd like to take a look at 1870, 1880, come on down to the historical study. You have it all in microfilm. You can put it in a reader, and you may research forever and ever if you want to. You could even become a member if you'd really like to, and be a volunteer and help us collect all this wonderful history. I've had a lot of time to hear people come to our society and say that there is no other place like this that is so small. We have no tax dollars, no government is telling us what to do. We're just a bunch of interested people in preserving the history as most accurately as we can. When we can gather from an individual who was at an activity or an event and can get word from that person to write up a little paragraph or two, we go for that because we want the truth. We're not politically minded in any way, so you're all welcome. Now, I'd like to see if there's any questions. Does anybody have anything specific you want to know about Rodney? Yes.
On the flyer, it said the last chief, and we know the Peters family from Grand Rapids that were chiefs, and they're still current. So we're questioning why you wrote, or somebody wrote that he was the last chief.
That's a good question. I personally don't have anything that says that, but you have to remember when I said 17 bands moved from the Grand River to Oceana and Mason County. So there was 17 chiefs of those 17 bands. There wasn't one over all of them. Kabmusa was over the Kabmusa band. Joseph Pebami was over the Pebami band, which were mostly Catholic, the only Catholic group. And of course they lived in Elbridge, north of the St. Joseph Church, which started as a St. Joseph Indian Mission Church. And those were his people. Then there was Generu and his people, and the others. I believe there were 7 or 8 up in Mason County. So by the time 1900 comes along, I'm not so sure if they had specific chiefs yet who took over. I've never had inside knowledge on that. I really don't know. Maybe you people could tell me. That would indicate that. The only thing I can tell you for sure is the old newspaper articles, everyone was the last chief. Every woman who passed away was at least 100 years old. This starts the typical headline. Now, whether it's right, wrong, or otherwise, I don't know, but that's kind of what you will see if you come and set out all the newspapers. They all couldn't have been over 100, but that seemed like the thing they were doing back in 1920.
So the Ottawa was broken into subgroups.
Actually, the 17 bands that moved were more than just Ottawa. They had intermarried into Ojibwe and the Potawatomi. So there were some bands that were heavily mixed already into the other tribes. Yeah, other bands. So I think that could be part of why the Grand River Band of Ottawa or the Grand River Band of Native American peoples have had a hard time being recognized, is because there's sort of like an invisible line across the 3 tiers of townships in southern Michigan, northern Indiana, Potawatomi. Then in the central part of the Lower Peninsula, you'll see Ottawa, up to Harbor Springs, Petoskey, Mackinac City, then you see the Chippewa or Ojibwe. So these people move. These people move more than I do, and I have trains, planes, cars, motorcycles, everything available to me. And these people actually moved a lot more than you'd ever think they would. So when you think about that, I can see why they're having a hard time identifying them, because they're not strictly one particular Ottawa, Chippewa, or Potawatomi. They are the most recent, historically written about tribes of Indians who have lived in the lower and upper peninsula of Michigan. There were many other tribes years beyond, which is prehistoric times, that have not been, recorded or written about. The Ottawa originally came from Canada through Manitoula Island. It's very similar to, I think you could equate it to when the Pilgrims came to Plymouth. John Smith came. Well, these people come and hit ashore. And then these people start dying and they have babies. It's the first thing they do when they hit the shore. And then they start moving because there's less land, less room, and things keep moving. Well, with the Native American peoples that started out on this eastern side of Canada, northern New York, Maine, they also had that pressure of people moving and population rising. And so in the 1600s, Ottawa came across. They came in at Saginaw Bay, right from Manitoulin Island in Canada. Have you noticed ever where Manitoulin Island is? They just had to get in a canoe, come right across that shallow Lake Huron when they were here. Beautiful place to come. I took a motorcycle trip around that area last year so I could get in my head what it was like. Any of the native peoples who came to the Great Lakes area, they came from that beautiful part of Canada where this reminds them of home, I'm sure, because it's very similar. Very, very similar in terrain. Okay?
As a kid growing up in Elbridge, I heard stories throughout the years about the old chief Kamusa getting gold from the government, and it was buried. He buried it, got sick, told his daughter, then he got better, redug it up, moved it, and then he got sick again and died. Is there any truth to that? And I heard it was like $52,000 years ago in American, in gold, I mean. But is there any truth in your research to that you know of?
Not to the oldest chief, Kamusa, because
Okay.
he was not receiving annuity money at that time.
Okay.
Now, a couple of his sons might have, and they were chiefs, and I'm sure that they probably were known as Chief Mabis. He was a Kamusa son, and the one George Kamusa, he was known as Chief Kamusa. So, not being there, but only seeing, annuities were only paid from the government till 1870, and he died in 1863. He was not a chief when he came here. His sons had taken over. So which one of those sons, I don't know. If you went to the National Archives and looked up annuities for the, I would think Great Lakes, Ottawa Indians, and at the time I believe it was Chippewa, Ottawa Indians, because that's what the 1870 annuity roll says at the top. Yeah, I think it does. You might find out how much money was delivered to who.
But have you heard of that story before?
I have heard of that story many times.
Okay, same here.
Yeah.
We have one like that over at White Cloud, about a chief White Cloud.
Okay.
Supposedly, he had, well, a group of Indians,
Right.
Indians had stole Morgan's, because White Cloud was Morgan's settlement, and so they had stolen the sergeant or whatever who was, Sergeant Morgan's settlement, took his daughter, and somewhere up by Broman, Denton Lake area. And then Chief White Cloud was living down by the White River, more, mini pond area, supposedly, and he made a deal with these roughnecks, and got the daughter back. And, so then everything was fine. There wasn't no fighting or whatever. That was the story. But the guys that got the money, it was supposedly hid or whatever, and then they all got killed or something like that. I don't know.
I think my great-grandfather did that too. You get 3 generations away and you don't know for sure, but boy, you'd really like a good story to tell, and you start telling a story.
Well,
It's sort of like when I used to go to Girl Scouts and we played telephone. And the story starts here this way, but when it comes, it's all different.
Yep.
None of us, having lived during that time, don't know for sure. I can't say for sure. I know that what I have found out when it comes to annuity monies and larger monies that were given by government is I have an old ledger from H.S. Sales Trading Post in Elbridge, Michigan, early 1860s. And there are all these Native American male names. And what I've been able to put together is this. Mr. Sales let them come into his trading post during the year. And they would take from the trading post flour, bullets, wool. What are some of the other things I've seen? It's all listed, and the price. And then he kept track. Then when the annuity money was announced that it was coming in by ship to Pentwater, the Indian agent would come. He'd have his money ready to give to the Native American chiefs. But what they would do is they'd come to Elbridge, and a chief in his group, and so on, would wait for the chief's name to be called. He would come into the trading post. The Indian agent would cut out of the box what was owed that chief, and then that chief would go with Mr. Sales out to his group of people, and if someone owed him $1.95 for flour, sugar, coffee, whatever, he would take that out of what was allotted to him, and then Mr. Sales was paid. Then he'd pay for those goods, restock his shelves, and the native people would come again through the year, picking up things that they needed for their homes. And then when the annuity was paid, then they would make it right with Mr. Sales. That has to be pretty close to probably what happened, because Mr. Sales was highly esteemed by all of the native families out there. So I think that's probably what happened. But you might see a chief getting $5,000, we'll say. He has to distribute and deduct what is owed to the trading post, because I highly believe the trading post and Mr. Sales at first were part of the government. I believe part of that treaty said there would be a trading post with an agent there, there would be a blacksmith who would teach and prepare farming equipment and repair farming equipment, and this was just part of the big plan after the 1855 treaty. Of course, it didn't hold up real well. They stopped paying annuities in 1870. And there are records of these annuities, right down to the individual, their name, how many people in their household, and how much they would have received of that annuity. Yes.
Wasn't Sales one of the first white family in Elbridge Township?
Yes, he came in with the government, yeah. He actually was a teacher. He was one of the small group of teachers that the government, they built 5 schoolhouses in Elbridge and Crystal, and they built one in Mason County too. Oh, I think I neglected to tell you this. There were more Native Americans of those 1,700 people living in Elbridge and Crystal than there were in Eden and Custer. This was a very small population. Elbridge held the most. That was the highest population. I can't repeat the numbers right off the top of my head anymore. But I think I counted total in like 1880 there was 700 and some people in Elbridge, but Crystal may have only had 3, 2 in Eden, 20, somewhere in there. It was very small. Custer had more. Custer Township was along the Pure Marquette River. It was a nicer place to live. You had more animals. You had fishery bayou. So Custer was popular. Eden and Crystal, not so popular. They're sand-blowing. You know, you really wouldn't want to be there. Elbridge has often been called the Garden Township because it has nice rolling hills. You can have orchards. You can have deer running. You can have the 2 Pentwater branches carrying fish from Lake Michigan. There were no dams. So fish from Lake Michigan were coming up and down the river, so it was a lovely place to live. And they hadn't cut all the trees. A lot of them had been cut, but not all. And there were just a few white people that came in after the native people were here. Some natives stayed. I'm getting off of Rodney here, but is anybody upset they're not hearing more of Rodney? Yes?
Yes, I'd like to know if Anna Mae Negake is still alive. She went to school, to Hesperia High School here when I was attending school in 46 and 47.
Anna Mae?
Anna Mae Negake, and she was younger than I, so I just wondered if she's still alive, what her name is, and where she is.
That I couldn't tell you, but if you came to the Munger building, I might be able to help you try and find that out.
Okay, thank you.
I'd love to find that out. Anything else about Negake that you would like to know? Yes.
They were neighbors of us down the road.
Wonderful.
And my mother, she'd go out and pick a bouquet of flowers and then make me take them over to Grandma again. Of course, you couldn't understand anything she said.
I have pictures of Mrs. Negake here. She looks like a very sweet grandmother. I would presume she was, because her family stayed very close to her. So I would assume she was a very loving, caretaking woman.
Well, we bought the house that they lived in. And Henry was in it, the youngest one, Henry. He stopped by several times and wanted us to sell it to him.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah.
Well, like the casino.
Isn't there a house in the of old log cabin of Kalmusa in the Hart Historical District or something that used to be out at Neil Wyrick's house in Outreach? Is that what Kalmusa was? That was that the old chief then, or do you know what I'm talking about?
He may have died in that building.
Oh, really?
Yes, but it was not his building. There has never been a building on the 80 acres that was granted to Chief Kalmusa. When
Right.
he came here, he was elderly, ill,
Right.
and he lived in the 80 above, which is the old Wyrick 80,
Right.
with his daughter and son-in-law. And that log cabin, I believe, is a sure shot to have been theirs.
Right.
And he lived with them. It says right in his probate record that he
Right.
lived with them and died with her.
Okay. And so, getting back to the gate there on the north side, so that's the old, we used to own that before we sold to Siebert's years ago. So that's where the Siebert house is, that the north side of the Kalmusa Lake you're talking about, where Rodney could
I
live?
didn't happen to bring a map where all these...
Okay.
I couldn't tell you. I'd have to have a map in front of me.
All right.
And that particular information as to what...
All right.
But if you come in and... I have a map on the wall at the Historical Society, and it is a plat map, 1876. It's the oldest of Oceana County. There are no small versions. It's huge. It's this tall, this wide. And somebody had the foresight in Oceana County to have that map drawn up, thank God. Mason County doesn't have one that old. And they were more advanced than we were. We were this rural, small, little county, but somebody amongst us had that map made. And you can go to Crystal and Elbridge Townships, and you can read the Native American names that were there, owned their land in 1876. And Rodney is there.
How many heirs of the Negakes still live in the area? Are they like correspondents for the Historical Society?
I have just a couple that have actually come into the Historical Society that are Negake descendants, but there are a lot of them around West Michigan, I would think, yeah. Some of them have retired and moved to Florida. There was a large group of natives who moved from the Oceana area just prior to World War II, when every farm boy, farm girl, farm Native American boy and girl moved from the hinterland to Muskegon for the war effort, because there were jobs. They could live so much better than being a farm boy. My father moved from Lake County, Michigan to do that, off a farm. I was born in Muskegon County. After the war, though. After the war. Yes.
And the gentleman asked where Negake was buried, and do I have it right? It is the Lost Cemetery in the woods?
No.
No,
Okay.
it's the one at Elbridge Catholic Church in
Oh,
on
yes.
144th.
Yes.
You said it so easy, and he knew, but I just had an inquiry, phone inquiry, but where the one is in the woods.
Well, there's probably several in the woods. Because, you know, when a group of people move to a pretty empty area, whether they come from Germany to New York or Germany to France or
Yeah.
Africa to Egypt, whatever. What happens first, do you think, when they walk from here to here?
Somebody died.
Somebody dies, somebody's born. And you have to immediately, usually, find where you're going to start burying your people. Right? That's how cemeteries get started. Well, the Native Americans, if they came here in 1857 and 58, the first thing that happened is there were marriages, there were births, there were deaths. And you have to take care of these things, especially death. So a cemetery would be in the woods. What might be the woods now, it was the back part of maybe their homestead or granted land. There's all kinds of things that you can think about that might put people in different places for burials.
I think what Marge Peterson's talking about in the woods, there is a cemetery behind the sales trading post.
Yeah.
Oh yes,
And-
that's the Pabani
and-
Cemetery.
Yeah,
Well,
Pabani.
that's the one.
That's the one.
Yeah, that's-
And that's a Catholic cemetery, see.
Right. Now, are you from?
So actually, you said Catholic cemetery, but I'm thinking, well, the one by the Catholic
Okay.
church, but there's actually two cemeteries, one kitty corner next to the
Right.
church, and then the one behind the sales trading post.
Right.
which-
You are very right.
Yep.
Yes, this is the old Catholic, and
Yep.
what we believe might have happened is Chief Pabani came with his native people in his band and immediately had a problem with someone passing away. Well, he gave that 1 acre of land, it's all in the courthouse, for a cemetery, because I'll bet you anything one of his people died and he had to find a place to bury them. And I believe what might have happened is that filled, and that's when things started being a little bit more advanced and more coordinated at the St. Joseph Church. And that's where they moved their burying area over to next to the church there that we see today. Because if you've gone there and looked, you can see the depression. It looks pretty full. But don't go there, please. That's somebody's family buried there, and it's very important that we respect them. I would expect all of you to respect my ancestors and their burial places. I think I had a couple of little tidbits here about Mr. Rodney. You know when he came to Hesperia? 1921. And he brought his son Frank and one other son, and I don't have it on this page, must be the page before. And of course I can't get the page turned now. Pardon?
Frank was married to my cousin, and they had a son, Carl.
Okay.
And Carl moved to Florida, and that's the last contact we had.
Okay. I think you should come and see me and help me make sure that we have, any of you who have information on the Negake family, I wish you would, so that when we put this back in the file, that it is in the most accurate, up-to-date condition that we can put it in. Because when you and I hear, there might be somebody under 50, but I don't think so. The next generation may not have the interest that we have today. It may not come to them to be interested until they're our age, and then it could be too late to gather it. So if you have anything pertinent